We all should guard our dopamine peaks very carefully. A little bit goes a long way, a lot goes even further, but it also takes you down deeper afterwards. If you get a really big dopamine increase, well, then that afternoon you might not feel the drive to do the work.
Andrew Huberman unveils the finite yet renewable energy of dopamine, shedding light on its crucial role in our physiological well-being.
Think about dopamine is that it is a non-infinite yet renewable resource. Non-infinite yet renewable. What do I mean by that? Well, this relates to the energy drink caffeine question. Should you be doing all this stuff? Just as adrenaline, epinephrine, is released in response to psychological stressors, physical stressors, cold water, final exams, broken relationship, excitement. I mean, these are generic molecules, right?
Delving into the intricate dance of neurotransmitters, Huberman explores the intriguing relationship between dopamine and testosterone molecules, illuminating their impact on our stress levels.
It's going to be hard to trigger that big release because you just had the peak. Well, if you adjust that, you relax, you understand there's always a little bit of a postpartum depression. We sometimes hear about postpartum depression. That's a clinical thing, but there's always that kind of, today's not as exciting as the previous days. What am I going to do with my life? But then if you let it start ratcheting up again, then what you realize is your capacity to tap into dopamine as a motivator, not just seeking dopamine rewards, that is infinite. The testosterone molecule and the dopamine molecule bear a very close relationship. So if somebody pushes really hard, wins, yes, that will increase testosterone. Winning increases testosterone. Losing decreases testosterone in all venues.
The art of creating activation states within the body becomes a focal point, offering a pathway to eliminate stress in mere seconds.
They're used to create activation states in the body. Dopamine is the molecule of motivation, pursuit, and desire. And it can be triggered by a number of different things. However, it is a non-infinite yet renewable resource.
Huberman urges viewers to cultivate awareness, emphasizing the profound impact it can have on the stress levels that accumulate throughout the day.
What I think it can be useful for people is to do what essentially you've done, Lex, is to start developing an awareness. When I wake up, am I mostly in a mode of interoception or exteroception? When I work well, what does working well look like from the perspective of autonomic arousal? How alert or calm am I? What kind of balance between internal focus and external focus is there? And to sort of watch this process throughout the day.
The mental orientation takes center stage as Huberman guides viewers to trigger dopamine-related pathways, presenting a proactive approach to stress reduction.
Getting into that forward center of mass mental orientation can start to trigger some of the pathways related to these hormones and these neuromodulators. What you don't want to do is start using a lot of exogenous factors, caffeine, or a lot of things outside of you in order to try and create those states, because then you're going to further deplete your dopamine and so on.
A cautionary note is sounded as Huberman reveals how overwhelming the dopamine system can occur, prompting a rethink of common habits and practices.
But if you start thinking about this in kind of a rational structure, it makes sense. It also makes sense why, for instance, after a big win, sometimes we feel a crash and we need some time to reset. And that low or depression, sometimes people make the mistake of going out and pursuing more dopamine. One of the areas that I have real concern about, just because I hear about it so often and it wasn't an issue when I was growing up, is a lot of young guys in particular approach me because they're, based on the questions I'm getting, they're watching a lot of really intense. And that has, we know, there are studies now going on at Stanford and elsewhere. It creates a strong dopamine rush. These are very primitive pathways that in some ways can overwhelm the dopamine system. And then, another thing is happening. There's a lot of young guys are getting all this arousal from watching other people have. And then they're in the real world scenario and it's like, wait, you're no longer third personing this. You're actually in this scene. and it's completely collapsing them.
To generate a robust dopamine and adrenaline response, Huberman advocates a dive into action, advocating for an active approach to stress management.
To really get into action, because that's going to generate its own dopamine and adrenaline response. Anytime I've worked out really early, like if I have a flight, and then moved into the other components of my day, I find that I feel better all day long. I also will say if I work out really early, maybe between 7 and 8 a.m., well, then my first meal might land at 9 a.m. Yeah. So, you need to be flexible with some of these things, but the general principles apply.
The precious nature of dopamine peaks is highlighted as Huberman underscores the importance of guarding and managing these peaks with utmost care.
Being in a lot of in a short period of time. The period immediately after that will involve a mirror symmetric decrease in dopamine. You don't go back down to baseline, you go below baseline. So we all should guard our dopamine peaks very carefully. A little bit goes a long way, a lot goes even further, but it also takes you down deeper afterwards.
The consequences of elevating limbic friction serve as a warning, illustrating the potential pitfalls of actions that could compromise our dopamine system.
The way I think about trying to build up resilience, physically or mentally or otherwise, is one of, I guess we could call it, I like to call it limbic friction. That's not a real scientific term, and I acknowledge that. I'm making it up now because I think it captures the concept, which is that, we always hear about resilience. It makes it sound like, under stress where everything's coming at you, you're going to stay calm. But there's another, so the limbic system wants to pull you in some direction, typically in the direction of reflexive behavior. And the prefrontal cortex, through top-down mechanisms, has to suppress that and say, no, we're not going to respond to the banging of the coffee cups behind me, or I'm going to keep focusing. That's pure top-down control. So limbic friction is high in that environment. You put yourself into a high limbic friction environment, meaning that the prefrontal cortex has to work really hard. But there's another side to limbic friction too, which is when you're very sleepy, there's nothing incoming. It can be completely silent. And it's hard to engage and focus because you're drifting off and you're getting sleepy. So their limbic friction is high, but for the opposite reason, autonomic arousal is too low. So they're turning on Netflix in the background or looping a song might boost your level of alertness that will allow top-down control to be in exactly the sweet spot you want it.
Actually, you can tell if somebody has a lot of dopamine and adrenaline in their system just by looking at them. Their pupils are big. So somewhat paradoxically, when pupils are big, your visual aperture is narrow. That just has to do with the so-called accommodation of the eye, the optics of the eye. So remember, big pupils means somebody is high on their own dopamine and adrenaline. Could be induced, could be situational, etc. Small pupils are going to be a relaxed state. Now, of course, it's also going to be modulated by how bright it is in an environment because of the way these systems work. But when you can see somebody wide-eyed, well, dopamine and adrenaline also do something else. They actually trigger activation of the brainstem cranial nuclei that cause opening of the eyelids. They also cause an eyes up effect. When we get sleepy, what happens? Our eyes go down. When we're awake, eyelids are open and eyes are up. They might not be up like this. These relate to 3 different cranial nerve nuclei. For the future med students, you'll learn what these are. So it all makes perfect sense because nature is beautiful and the biology is laid out for us. But if we start stacking behaviors plus pharmacology plus mindsets that increase dopamine, great. But what that means is that if you get a really big dopamine increase, well, then that afternoon you might not feel the drive to do the work. You might think, why am I sleeping in the afternoon? Why am I kind of less motivated? Or next day for training without that pharmacology.
But when you start thinking about models of how the brain works, there are only really 3 things that neurons do. They're either sensory neurons, they're motor neurons, or they're modulating things. And the models of attention and perception that we have now tell us that we've got interoception and exteroception. They're strongly modulated by levels of autonomic arousal. And that if we want to form the optimal relationship to some task or some pressure or something, whether or not it's sleep, an impending threat, or coding, we need to adjust our internal space-time relationship with the external space-time relationship. And I realize I'm repeating what I said earlier, but we can actually assign circuitry to this stuff. It mostly has to do with how much limbic friction there is, how much you're being pulled to some source. That source could be internal. If I have pain, physical pain in my body, I'm going to be much more interoceptive than I am exteroceptive. You could be talking to me and I'm just going to be thinking about that pain. It's very hard. And the other thing that we can link it to is top-down control, meaning anything in our environment that has a lot of salience will tend to bring us into more exteroception than interoception.
Concluding with a practical tip, Huberman advocates consciously dilating and contrasting one's visual field as a simple yet effective strategy to alleviate stress in seconds.
Learn to dilate and contract your visual field consciously. This can be done if you practice it a little bit. And then, as I said before, it is very hard to get into a state of focus like a step function immediately, like snapping your fingers. What you can do is you can pick any object, but ideally an object at roughly the same distance, placed at roughly the same distance to which you're going to do that work, and stare at it. You're allowed to blink. And as your mind starts to drift every once in a while, to understand that's normal, but try and narrow your visual aperture and bring that into your visual field so that that's the most prominent thing, kind of like portrait mode in your phone. This would look very different in portrait mode than it would in just a standard photograph mode. And then after doing that for 30 to 60 seconds, moving into the work that you're about to do, and really encourage yourself to do that. If you're somebody who's low vision or no vision, you're going to use your ears to do this. Braille readers have trouble focusing sometimes because they feel other stuff and they hear other stuff. So you learn to adjust that aperture consciously. And then, of course, there are the pharmacologic tools. Just enough caffeine, but not too much, right? We talked about white noise, brown noise, music or no music. Really varies, but it's very clear that binaural beats of 40 hertz can shift the brain into a heightened state of focus and cognition.
I can understand avoiding certain substances and behaviors, but the idea that you weren't going to look people in the eye because there's going to be too much dopamine, I mean, I guess it depends on who you're looking in the eye and how much their look positively arouses you. But the fact of the matter is that that's not a very rational way to think about dopamine detox. And dopamine itself is what's driving the human species to create these new technologies. And so while we think of currencies as the goal, it's actually what's really driven the forward evolution of our species has been the desire to go seek things beyond the confines of our skin. And when I say the common currency is dopamine, what I mean is the molecule dopamine, when secreted in the brain, makes us pursue things, build things, create things, makes us want new things that we don't currently already have. And so it has a lot of dimensions to it, but rather than think about dopamine as a signal for reward, like a dopamine hit, we classically talk about it, it's more accurate really to think about dopamine as driving motivation and craving to go seek rewards. That's the rat experiment. And it's a way of tabulating where we are in our life. Are we doing well or are we doing poorly? And that happens on very short time scales. Like, do you wake up feeling good? Or do you wake up feeling kind of low? Or on long time scales. If you're halfway through a long degree or you're halfway through your life, how are you doing? How do you gauge that? Well, it has everything to do with how much dopamine you were releasing in the previous days and weeks and years. So you're always comparing it, and all of this is subconscious. But what's cool is that once you make these processes conscious, once you understand a little bit about how dopamine is released and how it changes our perspective and our behavior, then you can actually work with it. So it's one of the instances where knowledge of knowledge actually turns out to be a really useful tool. So dopamine detox, I would have thought was not something real. It seemed kind of silly to me, actually. And I'll tell you why it seems silly and why it still seems silly, but why it may have some utility. But then Dr. Anna Lemke told me that it actually can be quite useful to take some time and space away from social media, certainly from any addictive, that's the treatment for addiction, and restore those dopamine levels to baseline. Now, the way that dopamine detoxing was initially described in the Bay Area, where it seemed a lot of tech types were talking about it, was in terms of, I heard something like, oh, people aren't even looking at other people's faces. You know, they're really kind of living this like monkish lifestyle, like no food that they really enjoy, no anything. That to me seems kind of crazy and kind of extreme. I mean, I can understand not ingesting a lot of highly palatable foods, eating some blander foods. I can understand certainly not doing any prescription or taking some time off from caffeine. Caffeine increases dopamine receptors, which makes the dopamine that's available more powerful at evoking the dopamine response.